Welcome to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. Thank you for joining us. I am so excited to have Bob Huff on the program. He is the Republican leader in the California State Senate. We are going to have some real fun. We're going to talk about some targeted state Senate races. And you know that Bob Huff has a lot to say about them. And I know there's a real concern in the Senate amongst the Republican caucus that if it's a good year for the Democrats could take 2/3 of the Senate seats. Why is that of concern?
Well, every 10 years we redraw the lines after the census is done. And under the previous lines, Republican senators had 13 safe seats, in which we held 15. 2 of them drawn for Democrats, Republicans won. With the redistricting commission, we ended up with 11 safe seats, and we have 4 seats to defend this year, just to stay at our current number, 3 seats to win in these targeted battleground seats to keep the Democrats from getting a supermajority.
Now, what's interesting is that there is an initiative on the ballot, Prop 40, which initially had been supported by the Senate Republican caucus. And what the initiative is asking is to, I guess it's approve the lines that were drafted by the independent commission.
Correct.
And so, but the party's now taken a different position.
Well, we had a legal opinion that said that if this ballot measure qualified, the referendum qualified, the judges would have to stay the lines, meaning they would not use the lines drawn by the commission. The judges did the opposite, and there was another legal opinion evidently that said that's what they could do, that's what they did do. They said, you know, this initiative process, referendum process, a lot of people have weighed in, let's just see what they have to say, rather than redrawing it. So that changed strategy.
So the view is, let's keep the lines, because if the lines go down, that means the lines have to be redrawn, causing more havoc.
Right.
So the party is supporting a yes vote on Prop 40.
Correct.
Okay, let's talk about 3 seats that are targeted by both parties. We'll start with Senate District number 5, Stockton, Modesto area, a real battle royale. 2 well-liked members of the California State Assembly, Assemblyman Bill Berryhill against Assemblywoman Kathleen Galgiani. Berryhill, the Republican, Galgiani, the Democrat.
Yeah, it's going great. You know, that's a district that we have been registering voters since the last election 2 years ago. And where this used to be upside down by a few points, it's within about 0.2, 0.3 right now between Democrat and Republican.
And I have to say, as I understood it, that if there's equal registration between the parties, that means the Republicans are leading.
Generally, we have not lost an election like this, and I don't know how long, where you're that close. And when we're pushing over 39%, it's been at least 12 years when Republicans have lost a seat.
How is the bankruptcy of the city of Stockton playing, if at all, in that Senate race?
Well, that's an issue just because of the fiscal meltdown. To the degree the state has outsourced its misery to the local level, that has impacted Stockton. To the degree that we killed redevelopment, that's hurt Stockton.
Sure.
The pensions that we are finally doing lukewarm reform, that's hurt Stockton.
Right.
So a lot of issues at the state level that are impacting that district.
Now, what's interesting about Mr. Berryhill and Ms. Galgiani is, as I see it, they're both fairly moderate. I mean, it's not as if you're having people coming from far sides of the political spectrum. Is that a fair analysis?
It's a fair analysis, but keep in mind the majority party tends to have more discipline in their ranks. So a moderate person, when you're talking one-on-one, and Kathleen Galgiani is a very nice lady. I love her. She's not in my caucus.
Right.
But nevertheless, when the speaker taps on her shoulder, or in the case when she comes to the Senate pro tem and needs her to vote a particular way, she's going to vote that way. So any sense of moderateness or representing the district first goes out, and they represent their leader first.
Okay, let's move to Senate District number 27. It's the district in which I grew up. I don't live there now, but I know the area quite well. San Fernando Valley, Thousand Oaks, Simi Valley. It is incumbent Senator Fran Pavley, a Democrat, running against Republican Todd Zink. That's an interesting race. I think it's fair to say that Fran Pavley comes from a more left-of-center perspective as opposed to Ms. Galgiani, for example.
That's a polite way to put it. Fran, another very likable person, but she went from a safe 27-point district, Democrat district, to a 5-point district. She went from a very safe, liberal, coastal community with Santa Monica, whatever, to a little bit more inland.
It's funny, I've spoken with her, and she herself calls the district Malibu to Magic Mountain. and if you live in that area or know that area, and those are so disparate. Oh, yeah. I mean, Malibu is, the more limousine liberals. And
well, this has Simi Valley, home to the Reagan Library. It's got Santa Clarita. 61% self-identify as fiscal conservatives.
The challenge, though, is unlike the Berryhill-Galgiani race, Mr. Zink is not a well-known name, at least He's not today.
But he's a very likable person. When people get to know him, and that's what you do through campaigning, this guy is a military officer. He's a prosecutor working under Steve Cooley.
Right, the DA.
You know, he's got no baggage to run against. He's just a really likable, great candidate.
Simultaneously, in that area, there's a hot congressional race going on. Tony Strickland, a very well-liked member of the Senate caucus, Republican side, and Julia Brownlee, an assemblywoman. That race is targeted by both the DCCC and the RCCC. How does that play for the state Senate race?
Well, to the degree there's an overlapping footprint, and there is some, I don't remember the exact amount, but it's fairly small, but you get some synergy in those overlapping areas, whether it's voter registration, or if you can get one base of Republican voters motivated, or maybe on Brownlee's part, getting some Democrats motivated, then that, helps their particular party, if you will.
We have to go to SD 31, Inland Empire District. This is just a crazy area as it relates to the elections. You have a competitive assembly race, Bill Beatty versus Juan Lopez. You have a competitive congressional race, Mark Takano versus John Tavallone, and of course the competitive state Senate race. An assembly member, Jeff Miller, the Republican, running against a Democrat, Richard Roth. Mr. Roth is running as a moderate. It is the Inland Empire. His wife is the chair of the Riverside Chamber of Commerce. This is another tough race for both sides.
It's a tough race, but that synergy, those overlapping gives the Republicans a lot of synergy there. There's been voter registration has actually flipped that district, so it's a majority of Republicans now, or not a majority, but a plurality, I guess.
Sure.
It's a little bit higher than the Democrats, and there's just, Roth has no background there. He's a great guy, from what I understand. I've never met him. But you have Jeff Miller, assembly member, accomplished record.
Has he? I had always thought Mr. Miller represented more San Diego County. Am I right? Or
no, he comes out of Norco. I mean, he was on the city council, mayor of Norco, as I recall, or Corona, one of those two.
Okay, so he is from the area.
Listening in that area.
It's hard to remember because also in that area there's the Dutton. Miller, another Miller, so it gets a little complicated. I do want to ask you, though, about the Inland Empire generally. It had always been safe Republican territory, but in 2008, Mr. Obama carried the Inland Empire for the Democrats. What's happening there?
Well, you have a lot of influx, you have a lot of unemployment out that area, but I think what you're seeing it flip back now is because their high-speed rail, they're not real happy with.
I've heard that.
That's a big issue. The housing crisis has hit them particularly hard. I mean, this administration has not helped that area a whole lot. So as we see the trends, we see the polling, actually in all three of these targeted districts that we have, where the election taken the day, and we're talking 6 weeks out, but we would win. Of course, the election's not held today.
And I do want to ask you about the national environment, because I think it's fair to say you would have to agree that President Obama, the Democrat, is running well ahead of Mitt Romney, the Republican in California. The polls I've seen have it Mr. Obama plus 14, plus 22, plus 24. These are daunting numbers for the Republican Party. Are you concerned that the drag of the Romney-Ryan ticket, if there is a drag by Election Day, could hurt your chances for these targeted races?
California is seldom in play on the national level, and so each of the candidates has to go out and make their own case. They have to educate the voters why they're the best of the two candidates to win. All of our guys are doing that. In fact, on that point, in the 27th, the Todd Zink, Fran Pavley, our polling shows Mitt Romney winning in that seat, which is how far that seat has changed from what Fran Pavley's running previously.
Okay, so as we look forward, what are your predictions, sir? As it relates to the Senate, be honest. You needn't name names. How about that? Because I know you love all your children. But what do you think the lineup will be come November 7th?
If I was handicapping this, I would say that we're going to hold those three. I would say there's an 80% chance. Okay. And should we lose one, and I would definitely say we're not going to lose more than one.
If you lose one, it's not a two-thirds Democratic, is that right?
It actually is.
Oh, it is?
If we lose any one of those, two-thirds Democrats, so they can override vetoes, or at least from the Senate, and then it's got to get through the Assembly.
Right, because the Assembly is not at the two-thirds level.
But typically, you get it through one house like that, you can move it through the other. So you override vetoes, raise taxes, Katie bar the door.
This has been great fun. His name is Bob Huff, Republican leader in the California State Senate. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back on California Edition. Welcome back to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. I'm glad you're still with us. Our guest now is Loren Collingwood. He is a professor at UC Riverside, and he specializes in looking at ethnic voting patterns, specifically Latino voters and African American voters. I'm glad you're with us today.
Pleased to be here.
I got to ask you about ethnic voting patterns, because if you look at the demographics of not just California, but the entire nation, there's no doubt that minorities will be a greater percentage of voters as we march through the 21st century.
Correct. By 2050, the United States will be a majority minority country, just like California is today. That will have huge implications for voting in American politics.
And when I think about those demographic trends, and I think about the current state of the parties, it seems that the Republican Party faces tremendous challenges. I mean, I remember a couple weeks ago, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said, we need to find more angry white men. He was saying it off the cuff, but there's something there.
Absolutely. Again, moving towards 2050, majority minority country, you see the Republican Party. A recent poll came out, 94% for Obama, 0% for Romney among African Americans. Latino, 0%.
Zero.
Latino voters tend to split between 65 and 75% for Obama at this point, and for Democrats, and Asian Americans too are also voting majority Democrats. So the Republicans have a big challenge with ethnic voters.
And we think about California. I remember in 2010 we had a gubernatorial race, and I think the Democrat Jerry Brown got 73% of the Latino vote, and the Republican got 18%. I mean, look, we know California is a blue state, but still, I mean, this is a daunting challenge for the Republican Party.
And California didn't used to be a blue state.
No.
It was a red state.
Dukakis lost it.
Exactly. And you had Governor Reagan and Nixon here. And then what happened in the 1990s is Pete Wilson went hard on immigration, much like you just saw in the 2010 Senate race between Harry Reid and Sharon Angle.
Right.
She went hard on immigration, and now that state is turning blue as well.
And he was the #1 target for loss.
Absolutely.
I mean, Harry Reid was going to lose. There was no question about it.
Every single poll had him down, losing by 5 points, and he ended up winning primarily because he mobilized ethnic voters, specifically Latinos, to a very high level.
So let's talk about the Latino vote, because here we are in California. It's not a swing state. We presume that President Obama will win this state. But there are states that traditionally had been red. Florida, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada. I mean, these were red states. A couple of them flipped in the last decade, but these are not blue states traditionally.
George Bush won basically all of those states at one point in his career.
Right.
New Mexico, for example, has been a swing state in the last 3 election cycles, and now it's not even considered a swing state. It was at the beginning, and Obama's ahead 8 to 10 points in that state.
And is it because of Latino voters? That's my question.
There's always many things, and as a political scientist and a social scientist general, you don't want to make causal explanations so much, but I would say as a talking piece point, yes, absolutely, it's because of the Latino vote in those places.
I do want to talk about Florida, because that really is a key state in this upcoming election. The polls I have seen have consistently showed President Obama ahead by a hair. A couple times I've seen polls with Mr. Romney ahead, but Mr. Obama does seem to be maintaining a solid, not solid, but a steady lead. How is the Latino vote playing in that state?
There's a few things to mention. You often hear that Cuban Americans who tend to vote Republican or disproportionately Republican in Florida are the driving force there, and that's why Republicans win that state. But what's important to note is that Cuban Americans, the younger generation, people below the age of 40 that didn't come here, that are second generation and Cubans tend to vote Democrat. And the older ones tend to vote Republican. And so you see this huge difference between a parent and their child and their voting behavior, and that's not common.
And what's so interesting about Latino voting patterns is that, a lot of Californians, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social moderate or liberal. With the Latinos, it's almost the reverse. Latinos will tend to be more socially conservative, fiscally moderate, so you would think they would be ripe for Republican persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 2 points to be made on that. One is the Republican hard line on immigration, and the other is, despite Latinos' conservative stance on many social policy issues, they do trust government. They want government to invest in education and things like this, as opposed to cutting taxes, about 2 to 1.
I want to ask you about a comment that Mitt Romney made that has not endured to his benefit, and that was, My parents, my father lived in Mexico, and if I had had Mexican parents, I'd have a better shot at winning this race. What do you make of that statement?
First of all, it was a joke, but then he said, well, not really. And so these off-the-cuff statements are going to hurt him.
Right.
And he's obviously trying to identify in some degree, and he in that statement alone, he's paying homage to the rise of the importance of the Latino vote in many of these cases. So if he had a better way to identify with Latino voters, say, his son is going around speaking Spanish.
Who I understand speaks Spanish beautifully.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the way to appeal to Latino voters. But you also have to appeal to them based on policy issues, and he's not doing that.
I do want to ask you about Latino frustration with President Obama, because there is frustration.
Absolutely.
President Obama had promised for immigration reform. He went on Univision recently and really apologized. He apologized, which was quite an interesting approach by a politician. He did get some DREAM Act elements passed through executive order. Where do we come down on this issue?
Well, the first 2 or 3 years of his presidency, Latinos, especially Latino elites, were extremely frustrated with Obama because he did not put that on the agenda. And at the same time, deportation was skyrocketing, even relative to Bush.
More. Higher
that's
deportation
what I mean.
rate.
Right. And so what that means is that in some sense, Obama is worse to Latinos than Bush when you just look at deportation rates. However, the Democratic Party in general has been there on things like bilingual education and other important issues specific to the Latino community that involve government investment relative to Republicans.
So how do you expect the Latino vote to break come November 6th?
It would be about 70-30, maybe 72-28.
That's a big chunk.
And in places like Colorado, Florida even, because now you still have a lot of Hispanics there who are not Cuban and vote Democratic.
Sure.
And these places, and so they're going to swing the election in places like Colorado and New Mexico, and then moving forward by 2016 and later, you're going to see Texas and Arizona swing to the Democrats. That's my projection.
I have heard Texas could be blue in 2020. Yeah. Let me ask you about African Americans.
Sure.
Yes, Mr. Obama is biracial. He has an African American father. I do want to get a sense, though, of whether African Americans are just completely lost vis-a-vis the Republican Party. Is there just no hope for the Republican Party to pick up African American votes?
Not this go round, no. No, not at all.
I mean, is that poll that Romney got 0% of African Americans, is that really legitimate?
It's probably like we were talking earlier, it's probably 0.2. I don't want to. I would speculate that many African Americans would feel embarrassed among their friends if they came out and claimed that they were supporting Romney.
Given that, we do know that the South has high African American populations. So why aren't any Southern states, but for Florida, which is really a northern state?
Right. Yeah. The farther you go south, the more northern you get.
More in play. Virginia, of course, but that has the D.C. suburbs. Why aren't they more in play?
Well, it's two things. There's the peripheral states like Virginia and North Carolina that are in play, and even in 2008, you saw Georgia start to swing a little bit, but it didn't win, and it's going to easily go for Romney. But the main reason is you see in many of those states, whites are voting 90% for Romney. 85% for Romney. You just can't go. You need about a 30% at least of whites in those states to support the Democrat.
And they're not at this stage.
Not. The South is completely split along racial lines vis-a-vis blacks and whites.
So come 2016, presumably the top of the ticket on the Democrats, they will not be African American. Where do you see African Americans cutting as we march throughout this decade and beyond?
Well, I see them staying within the Democratic Party. The unfortunate thing for African Americans relative to Latinos is their population is pretty much holding constant.
Right.
And so they have less sway over policy and politics. You could make that argument. Mm-hmm. And so I think they will stay within the Democratic camp, but Republicans, if they were smart, would try to make more government involvement positions and stop saying things about welfare and things that are racial cues to African Americans that really hurt them.
Is the headline on November 7th that minorities, ethnics elected President Barack Obama to a second term?
That is a headline that could be made, and a lot of people within the race and ethnic politics community that study these things have long said that race and ethnic politics is a key position. I mean, you had people like Truman, for example, got elected in 1948 in part because of his quote-unquote cross-racial mobilization of African-American voters.
Okay. His name is Loren Collingwood. He's a professor at UCR. When we come back, we'll be speaking with one of his colleagues, Karthick Ramakrishnan, about Asian-American voting patterns. I'm Brad Pomerance. We'll be right back. Welcome back to California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. I'm glad you're still with us. Yes, he is back. Karthick Ramakrishnan. He is a professor at UC Riverside, and he looks into Asian American voting patterns. In fact, he is the director of the National Asian American Survey 2012, which just came out. You've been traveling around the country. Thank you for being here. What can you tell us?
Well, what we found this time in some ways is a continuation of what we found last time. So Asian Americans are still bedeviling us in terms of a high proportion of people that are undecided.
They are. It is high undecideds.
Yeah. So if you compare the way we ask the question to other surveys that ask it the same way, we don't push people who say that they're undecided to say, well, truly, who do you lean towards? We didn't ask that. But even when you compare the standard question, if they've made up their mind or not and who they're going to vote for, you have about 32% of Asian Americans who have not made up their mind.
That's a big number.
That is
and I do want to go back and ask, what are Asian Americans?
So Asian Americans, it's a racial category in the United States. So even though you may have people who immigrate from Iran or Afghanistan, they are not considered Asian American. It all is based on what kind of census category checkbox you do. So typically it goes all the way from Pakistan, all the way east to Japan, and it includes Southeast Asia as well.
So Asian Americans is not just folks from what we think of as Asian countries, the China, the Japan, the Thailand.
Right.
It includes India. I mean, that's really the key.
Yeah, and that's important. India. It's important to note because the Indian American population has grown pretty rapidly. So they are now the second largest group among Asian Americans.
What's the first?
The first is Chinese American.
And what's interesting about the Indian American community is that they have demonstrated the strongest support amongst all Asian communities for the current president.
Right. So if you look at their approval rating, it's very high. It's among the highest for any group in the United States. If you look at their favorability rating for President Obama, again, it's extremely high. And their favorability rating for Romney is pretty low. In many ways, it looks like Indian Americans are starting to move towards where African Americans are in terms of their level of political support. It is that high.
That is remarkable. Why do you think that is, sir?
So there are a few factors. One is you had many Indian Americans who came of political age during the Clinton administration, and
which continues to be a popular one.
It is popular, and especially among Asian Americans, you had an administration that was seen as friendly towards economic growth, but also that cares about discrimination.
But what's interesting is two of the highest profile Republican governors are Indian Americans.
Right.
Bobby Jindal, who, and I know you'll appreciate what I'm saying, presents as Indian American.
Yep.
Nikki Haley doesn't present as much as Indian American, just her visage.
Right.
But, I mean, these are high profile individuals.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that they are very much the exception and not the rule. And this is something that, even when I talk to some reporters who cover the Indian community who haven't seen some of these surveys before, someone asked me, well, if you look at the donors and if you look at the high-profile elected officials, it seems pretty split. In fact, it looks more Republican to me. Well, that's the reason why we do surveys like this.
Right.
We can't just rely on particular people and anecdotal evidence.
And here we are in California, and many folks may not realize that our Attorney General, Kamala Harris, is half African-American, half Indian American.
Right.
So she, I understand, does her best to appeal to everyone, but of course both communities.
Right. So in the Democratic National Convention, she was the most high-profile Indian American speaker.
Interesting. I want to continue and ask about another community which is quite large, especially in California. That's the Filipino community.
Right.
Talk to us about their voting propensity, their trends.
So the Filipino community, it looks like there's been a bit of a shift. What we saw in 2008 was that Filipinos favored Obama over McCain by about 6 points.
Not large.
Not large. And now it looks like it's shifting the other way in which they prefer Romney over Obama by 6 points.
Why? I mean, they're the only community amongst the Asian American communities that are supporting Romney. Why is it that they have found him as their preferred candidate?
So we tried to dig deeper into the data to try to figure this out. From what we can tell, things like the Affordable Care Act was not popular among Filipinos.
I wonder, I even hesitate to go there, but I must ask, I wonder if it's because, again, I don't want to be stereotypical, but a lot of Filipinos do work in medicine. I mean, I think about, outstanding nurses. Again, I don't want to be, you know what I'm saying.
But that's also true of Indian Americans, right? So you have a fair number of Indian doctors, not nurses, right? But doctors. I think that's part of it. I've also heard a little bit that there's been some controversy in terms of how the Filipino veterans benefits are supposed to be implemented. There was actually a
yes.
portion of the law that was supposed to apply to Filipinos who fought on behalf of the United States.
I know what you're saying.
And there's been some controversy in terms of whether that's been implemented in a proper way.
Did I speak too soon? Because I didn't mention Vietnamese Americans who have traditionally been quite Republican.
Right.
How are they trending now?
What we're finding, and this is a big surprise, is that most of them say that they're undecided, and the people who say that they're nonpartisan is at record highs from what we have seen. And that is just extremely fascinating, because for decades we have thought of the Vietnamese vote as a lock for the Republican Party.
Right.
And what we're finding now is that there's a shift happening. Part of that is a generational story.
Right.
The second generation is less concerned about anti-communism. But even the older generation, what we find is that support for the Affordable Care Act is highest among Vietnamese. So while they may believe strongly in anti-communism, they also believe in social welfare spending. And a lot of it is because they were eligible for refugee assistance when they came.
I just spoke with your colleague, Loren Collingwood, and it was quite easy to point to states where the Latino vote could make the difference.
Right.
Are there states where the Asian American vote, we can really say this is where it could make a difference?
Right. So there are 3 states where that is likely. One is Nevada. So you have a fairly large Asian American population, over 5% of the electorate, and we know that counts. All of these states where, so Nevada and Virginia, 5%.
Virginia too.
Yeah, 5% of the electorate.
And what's the third state?
Third state is North Carolina.
And it's interesting because I had thought, as we speak today, that North Carolina would fall to Romney. Now I'm not so sure.
This is a very dynamic campaign, right? So, I mean, so that's part of the reason our surveys are still being fielded as we speak. So we had over 3,000 respondents. So
that's quite big scientific.
That's a big scientific survey, but we'll still collect data on what people are thinking in the weeks ahead. And so we think that North Carolina, if the national trends are going the way they are, it could come into play. And there in North Carolina, you have a sizable Indian American population that could play a pivotal role.
As I was speaking with Professor Collingwood, we were talking about demographic patterns and how they are not boding well for the Republican Party as we speak today because of certain anti-immigrant rhetoric that's coming out of high-profile Republicans. How does that play for Asian American communities?
That's interesting because in many ways, Asian Americans are not what elected officials think about and talk about when they talk about, say, illegal immigration or just immigration in general. But there is a kind of collateral damage that occurs. Because generally speaking, you have some shrill voices on the Republican side, much more so than the Democratic side. And those voices aren't necessarily silenced. People aren't disavowing them. It's very rare. You'll find people like Jeb Bush that denounce some of those comments. But a lot of times, people making those comments are welcomed within the Republican tent, and that creates a party image in the minds of many immigrant voters that turns them off. And that's something that's unfortunate because in order for the Republican Party to be competitive, but also for these communities to get attention, they need to be paid attention to by both parties, and we're not seeing that, and that could prove to be a problem in all sorts of ways.
We know that historically Latinos have not voted in proportion to their numbers, and even African Americans the same. What about Asian Americans? Do they vote in proportion to their population?
They do not. So Asian Americans have among the lowest turnout rates among adult citizens. And that is surprising because—
Lower than Latinos?
Just a hair lower Latinos.
Wow.
And that's surprising given how relatively well off the community is.
Educated.
Right. Well off and educated, right? So, I mean, you have variation within the Asian American community. So you have Hmong and Cambodians and Vietnamese.
Is it fear of getting involved in government at all?
So
just stay away?
I think part of it is people, especially immigrants, I mean, so Asians are the most heavily immigrant community. And that's something that I think most people don't realize, is that they are the most heavily foreign born. So they're just trying to get their bearings. They're trying to figure out life in the U.S. They're trying to get an economic foothold here. Politics is one of the things that comes later.
I understand. Okay, his name is Karthick Ramakrishnan. He is a professor at UC Riverside. We thank you so much for joining us. My name is Brad Pomerance. This has been California Edition.